right, let's start this order of operations video with some order of operations containing multiplication and division with signed numbers, as well as all of the order of operations that we have dealt with before. Just a quick reminder, order of operations, PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division. Remember that multiplication and division comes in left to right order as we see them, and addition, subtraction also comes in left to right order. So our first example here, I'm going to look through and I see I have an operation of addition, and then there's operation of multiplication, but there's parentheses which then have subtraction and multiplication within it, and then there's an exponent out here. So the first place I'm going to start with is with those parentheses. So inside the parentheses I have a multiplication that comes before a subtraction. So 3 times 2, I'm going to do that first, and that's going to give me a 6. And so now I have 2 subtract 6 within there. And so this needs to be done using integer addition. So this is 2 plus a negative 6, and this is 6 minus 2 because they're opposite signs, and then it will be a negative when I'm done with it. So now the whole parentheses is simplified. I'm going to write the entire problem with just that piece redone. Negative 3 plus negative 5. Now the parentheses are still going to remain, even though it's just going to be a negative 4 within those parentheses, and that is going to get squared. So now what I need to do is I need to take care of this exponent right here. So this is going to be a negative 4 times a negative 4. And so that will give me a positive, negative times a negative is a positive, and that will give me a positive 16. And so next what I have is negative 3, and then plus, and then what I want to do is this negative 5 times this positive 16. And so that's going to be a negative number because a negative times a positive is a negative. And if I want to, I can do the multiplication right here. 5 times 6 is 30, carry the 3. 5 plus 3 is 8. So that's a negative 80. And now I just have integer addition. These are both the same signs. So I'm going to be adding these two numbers together, and I'm going to be keeping their common sign. So when all is said and done, my final answer will be a negative 83. And that completes our first problem. Now moving on to the next one. I see I have some subtraction, I have some multiplication, and some division here. So the first thing is going to be the multiplication, because multiplication comes first in this left to right order of multiply, divide, not because it's just multiplication first. So the first thing I'm going to do is multiply these two numbers, and I'm going to look at this as subtract whatever this thing is down here. So this is a positive 3 times a negative 6, which is a negative 18, and then that is going to get divided by negative 9. So now I'm going to recopy the problem. This looks like 5 subtract, and then negative divided by a negative is a positive, and 18 divided by 9, which is 2. And then that looks just like 5 minus 2, which is 3. Now that isn't the only way that I could do this problem. Another way I could look at this problem is I could say, oh, well, this is really 5 plus, and then I could change this to addition, right? And say this is a negative 3 times a negative 6, and then that's divided by a negative 9. And so this, a negative times a negative, is equal to a positive, and then a positive divided by a negative is a negative, and 18 divided by 9 is 2. And so in this case, it would look like 5 plus a negative 2. And we know that when we have opposite signs, we subtract the two of them, and then we keep the sign of the larger, which in this case is positive. And we see that it really didn't matter which way I interpreted that, as add an opposite of this number, or whether I just took it as a subtraction of the thing that followed here. It became the same number. But we want to be consistent in the methods that we deal with that, so we're not confused. All right, now here are a couple of problems for you to try on your own. There are 2 separate problems here. So I'm going to encourage you to shut off the video and complete these problems on your own, and then turn the video back on and see the answers and see if you got them correct. All right, looking at this first one, we have a division problem, we have an addition problem, and we have a multiplication problem. So in order of operations, division and multiplication happen at the exact same time, so I'm going to do these two, the division first and then the multiplication, although it really doesn't matter because they're not involving one another's answers. So a negative divided by a positive is going to be a negative, and 5 divided by 5 is 1. And then plus, and a positive times a negative is a negative, and 1 times 10 is 10. And now I have an integer addition problem. They're both the same signs, so that means that I'm going to be adding the numbers while we're ignoring their signs, and when it's all said and done, I'll attach the common negative sign. So my answer is going to be a negative 11. Hopefully that one was correct when you had done it on your own. All right, now moving on to the second problem, I see parentheses here. So I'm going to start within these parentheses first. So this is a subtraction problem inside here, so I'm going to change this to addition, a negative 2 plus a negative 5. Well, because they're both the same signs, I'm going to be adding those up and attaching the common sign. So I'm going to get a negative 7 there. But this negative 7, remember, is in parentheses and being squared. So that means that I'm going to take a negative 7 and use it as a factor 2 times, a negative 7 times a negative 7. And then negative times a negative gives me a positive, and it's a 49. So now I've taken care of everything here, but remember this 49 would be in parentheses because it was originally in parentheses before, and that's telling me that negative 3 out here is going to get multiplied by this entire answer. So we have negative 3, rewriting this just so we don't get confused, and in parentheses the 49 that we got from doing this entire process here, the parentheses and the exponents that come before multiplication, and then plus, and then the 4 divided by 2. And that way, we're not dealing with so many things going on and I'm confused about what I've done and what parts I still have to do. Now I can see my problem a little bit more clearly. So now I see that I have this multiplication problem and this division problem. Multiplication and division come at the same exact time in left to right order. So we'll do the multiplication as it comes first, so negative times a positive is a negative, and then 3 times 49, if you need to, you just write it down here, right, and say, okay, 3 times 9 is 27, carry the 2, and 12 plus 2, which is 14, and remember a negative times a positive is a negative, so negative 147, and then plus, and then a 4 divided by 2, which gives me 2. Now these are an addition problem, and they're opposite signs, so I'm going to take the larger one, 147. I'm going to subtract the smaller one, 2, and I'll attach the larger sign, the negative. So that's going to give me a negative, and 147 minus 142, which is 145. And that will be my final answer. Hopefully that one also went well for you. Now, in this next problem, we have a radical. So the radical can be considered a parenthesis, and it can also be considered an exponent because a radical actually is an exponent of 1/2. You'll learn that later on in an algebra class. But right now, this is acting like a parenthesis because there's several problems in here. So we're going to rewrite a radical here, and then we're going to simplify what's inside this radical. Now multiplication and division are inside this radical, and that multiplication and division come in left to right order because they're all involving one another. So we're going to do this division first, and 5 divided by 5 is going to give me 5, and then we'll do that multiplication. And then after we're done with the radical, then we subtract 13, and I'm just going to copy it down here. I have plenty of room. So now I still need to do this multiplication, and 5 times 20 is 100. And so what I have is the square root of 100. Now remember, a square root, this radical symbol here, when there's no index out here, it's a square root. This, remember, means that I'm looking for a number that when I square it, it equals that 100. So I'm looking for this number here. And the number that when I square it equals 100 is 10. So the answer to the square root of 100 is 10. Now I don't put radicals around that or anything else. That is the answer. That's what the root simplifies to. So that's all I write. And then subtract 13. And so now I have a subtraction problem. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to an addition problem. And I'm going to do that in a different color. So I am going to change this with a red marker there. And then back here, this now says 10 plus a negative 13. Well, we have opposite signs, so the big one 13 minus the small one 10, and then it's a negative sign because the larger one is negative. So this is going to be a negative 3 as our final answer. All right, moving along. Our next example has a fraction bar in it. Fraction bars are considered parentheses, so you have to do what's on the top and then what's on the bottom because they are making a parenthesis of the top and a parenthesis of the bottom, even though it's not written. So I'm going to work with the top here first. So the first thing is the parenthesis within the top. So 3 plus 1, which is 4. And then the next thing that I would see is that I have this multiplication, and then I have a division. Remember, multiply, divide, left to right order. These things involve one another, and so I just go right on across. So 5 times 4, which is equal to 20. Now I have negative 3. And we can do one of two things. We can either leave this as a subtraction and get this answer and then deal with that subtraction, or if you wanted to, you could have said plus and attached the negative sign to the 5, and this would have been then a negative 20. It's totally up to you. I'm going to leave it as a subtraction, and that is 20 divided by 4. And 20 divided by 4 is a 5. Now one last step here. I'm going to change that to an addition problem, plus a negative 5, and that shows you that I have a positive, a plus because I have the same sign, so I'm going to add 5 and 3, and it's going to be negative when I'm done. So my answer is going to look like negative 8 in the numerator. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to deal with the denominator. Now this right here, we have to be really, really careful of, because a lot of people look at this and they say, oh, well that means negative 3 times negative 3, but it doesn't. That negative 1 can have a 1 put, or a negative can have a 1 put with it. And then it becomes very clear that it's not the negative that's being squared. This really says the opposite of 3 squared, which means the opposite of 3 times 3. And when we put some parentheses around for ourselves, it makes it much easier. So this answer is actually a negative 9. So now I have a negative 9 minus a 1. And then I'm going to change that to addition, so plus a negative 1. And so now I have two negatives again, so 9 plus 1, which gives me 10. And then I have a negative there. And so this is going to give me a negative 10. Now, we're going to simplify this resulting fraction. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. It is necessary to simplify that. If you have a negative over a negative and you write it as a final answer of a negative over a negative, I will mark it incorrect. And I would bet any teacher that you may have would mark that incorrect. And then 8 over 10, that needs to be reduced. So we are going to divide out the GCF. The GCF, of course, is 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. And our final answer is a positive 4/5. Finally, here's a problem for you to try on your own. And again, I would encourage you to do this while you have the video shut off, and then turn it back on and look at the answer. Now, this one is going to be a negative 3 within here, and that is going to be squared, so it is going to give us a positive 9. This is going to give us a negative 36, so this is 5 minus 36 plus 1, which is going to give us a negative 31 plus 1, which equals a negative 30. And then we're going to get a simple answer on the bottom here.